Well, dear students, welcome to lecture number 2. This is a pre-recorded lecture on blood rheology, which is our second topic, our second lecture. So maybe we take a quick look at a course schedule. So we're here on the second line. This is our, if you want to say, introduction to the topic of blood flow. We first want to have an understanding of how blood is behaving as a medium, as a fluid medium, and then we'll go on next week to look at the cardiovascular system as a whole, how blood's flowing through vessels. We'll be looking in 2 weeks at arterial diseases, flow in large blood vessels, microcirculation, RBC transport. We'll sort of close this series of 5 lectures on blood flow. So today the topic is blood rheology. If you look up the term rheology in Wikipedia, you see that rheology is the word for the study of the flow of matter, in that case the flow of blood, in response to applied force. That sounds a bit generic. Maybe I can give you a little example here. This fluid, it's obviously not blood. It's actually a mixture of water and cornstarch, so maizena in German. And this fluid, this mixture, is on the top of a loudspeaker, and the loudspeaker is vibrating. And well, as you can see, there's a really interesting shapes produced. So it's doing that because this fluid is the so-called non-Newtonian fluid. It's shear thickening. So shear thickening is a fluid which becomes more viscous if there's high shear or shear rates actually. So what is happening is when the loudspeaker is vibrating or oscillating, we have relatively high shear rates because it's vibrating very fast. High shear rates acting on the fluid, and becomes more viscous, or it becomes more thick, if you want to say it. That's how you can build up these structures. By the way, this mixture of maizena and water, that's something you can also try at home. You may want to play a bit with the right ratio of mixing it, but if you put this like in a glass or a little beaker, and you start, well, feel it with your finger, and try to move your finger in this liquid, in this solution. If you move them very slowly, it will feel like you're moving them in water, so a low viscosity. And if you move them very fast, you will feel a lot of resistance. And that's exactly this shear thickening behavior. So this is an example of a fluid with a rather complex rheology, with the shear thickening rheology. We'll see later on that blood is also a relatively complex fluid. It's actually the opposite. It's a shear thinning fluid. Okay, so much on rheology, and a fun example of complex rheology. Now, if we describe this a bit more mathematically, what we want to understand in this lecture is the viscosity of blood. I just want to remind you how viscosity is defined classically in fluid mechanics. We take a look at this sketch here, down here at the bottom, pointer here. So we have a wall at the bottom, a wall down here, and the flow going parallel to this wall. And this flow, this parallel flow, is creating a boundary layer. So zero flow at the wall itself, and increasing fluid velocity as you go away from the wall. The gradient of this velocity profile, so the gradient is du dy, so u being the velocity which is increasing with the wall normal coordinate y, so du dy is the gradient of this velocity profile. you can think also of du dy as a shear rate. It's not the shear. Shear is something you have like a solid mechanics. Shear is like the deformation, and the deformation rate, or is the shear rate, and that's described by du dy in this particular uniform flow. It is known that the shear stresses acting inside the fluid or between two fluid elements, the shear stress tau is proportional to the shear rate. And this proportionality is described by the proportionality factor mu. And that mu is defined as the viscosity, the dynamic viscosity to be precise. That's also something we use very often, and we will talk about more, I think in 2 or 3 weeks when we talk about cardiovascular diseases. The wall shear stress, if you look at the wall itself, the gradient of the velocity profile, the gradient of velocity profile at the wall directly determines the friction forces, the wall shear stress acting on the wall surface or in blood flow. This will be the inner side of the blood vessels. And that shear stress, that wall shear stress, is directly proportional to the local gradient at the wall, and the proportionality constant is this dynamic viscosity mu. For many fluids, such as water, for instance, mu is a constant. For water, for instance, mu is 10 to the minus 3 Pascal second. That's the unit used for dynamic viscosity. For more complex fluids, this mu is not a constant anymore, but it can actually change with many other parameters. I gave down here a few examples. For instance, the temperature will have an effect on the viscosity. Also, this quantity HT, we'll define that later on. It's the hematocrit, so it's the concentration of red blood cells, has an effect. And, which may be surprising, also the shear rate itself has an effect on the viscosity. And this is shear thinning or shear thickening effect. But we'll go into more detail on that later on. First thing I just want to say, we talk of a Newtonian fluid if this mu is a constant. We talk of a non-Newtonian fluid if mu is a function of some other parameters or it's just another constant. For all practical purposes, we will assume that blood can be considered Newtonian in the large blood vessels, in the macro circulation. I will give you a reason for that, or I'll give you an idea of how you can judge whether it's safe to assume that it's a constant or almost a constant, and where, namely in the macro circulation, we have to consider this non-Newtonian behavior. But in order to understand all these relationships between different parameters, we should probably first look at the blood anatomy, learn a bit more about what blood actually is. So first of all, blood is a suspension of formed elements. It's a particulate solution, it's a fluid with some particles in it. The base fluid is called the plasma, blood plasma, roughly 55% of it. The majority of the blood particles are red blood cells, roughly 45%. Depends a bit on the particular individual we're looking at, can go up or can go down. There are many more blood particles like white blood cells, blood platelets, and a few more, but all these other blood particles, they make up for less than 1% of the whole blood volume. So in terms of fluid mechanics or in terms of rheology, they do not really matter that much. Yeah? We have to consider them anyways, but for the particular a question of blood rheology, it is actually sufficient to look at blood plasma and red blood cells alone. Let's look at them one by one. First, blood plasma. So blood plasma is a yellowish aqueous fluid, a little bit like water, at least in terms of the mechanics of plasma. We do have a dynamic viscosity mu of 0.0012 Pascal second. So that's almost the viscosity of water at room temperature. It's actually approximately 1.2 times higher than water. However, the viscosity of plasma alone is about 3 to 4 times lower than that of whole blood, so blood with everything in it. So the plasma itself is not that viscous. It consists of many things, a lot of ions, proteins, and a lot of things are suspended in it, but they're mechanically not relevant, at least not for what we are doing here. For whatever we are doing in this course, we can consider plasma itself, only the plasma, as a Newtonian fluid, a homogeneous Newtonian and incompressible fluid. Red blood cells, as I said, this is the vast majority of blood platelets. We also use different names for that, erythrocytes, or the short acronym that is very often used in publications and textbooks. It's RBC, red blood cell, RBCs. I guess you have heard what the main role of these red blood cells is in physiology. They are there to transport the oxygen from the lungs toward organs and tissue. From a mechanical point of view, these red blood cells are quite interesting objects. They are not rigid particles, they're actually flexible capsules. So they are consisting or comprising a flexible membrane, which sort of makes up the surface of the red blood cell, a flexible membrane. And this flexible membrane encloses a solution, a fluid solution of hemoglobin. And that solution is a relatively viscous solution. It has a viscosity of about 0.006 Pascal second, so about 5 times the viscosity of plasma or 6 times the viscosity of water. Okay, so we have plasma around, low viscosity, and suspended in this plasma we have these capsules with a membrane, and inside this membrane we have this highly viscous fluid. If you take a red blood cell, look at it under a microscope, and that red blood cell is not under stress, it's in fully relaxed configuration, it will have the shape shown here on the right hand side, this kind of a donut shape or discoid shape. It has a diameter of roughly 8 microns, maybe a bit less, and the thickness of roughly 2 microns. Just for you to get sort of a relation, the smallest capillaries, the smallest blood vessels that we have a diameter of around 5 microns. So you immediately see there's a problem to squeeze 7.5 in that case red blood cells through a vessel of 5 microns. So obviously red blood cells must be deformable, and they are deformable obviously because on the inside it's a fluid, it's a viscous fluid, but it's a fluid, and the membrane is very, very flexible and it can deform. We see this here in this little animation as a numerical simulation of red blood cells flowing through a vessel with here this spherical obstruction. And you see as they pass over the obstruction, they are deforming, they're changing their shape. What you can also see is that these red blood cells, in this movie at least, they do not have this classical discoid shape. Instead, they have more something which is very often called a parachute shape. So it's more like a cap. They're heavily deforming. There are numerical simulations. These are rather old results. I think some are from the 90s, but they're still quite valid. And they show in 2D the shapes or the cross-sectional shapes of red blood cells in different vessels. So this shape here, the largest one, that would be the shape of a red blood cell in a vessel of that size, like the outermost straight line. And as the lines, the vessels get smaller, the lines move in, we get a more and more elongated shape of the red blood cell until about the last or the smallest, the most narrow case, narrow vessel where it has this bullet shape here. To see that the red blood cells are actually adapting to the shape of the surrounding vessel or the size of the surrounding vessel. And of course, also, if there are neighboring vessels, there's a lot of cell-cell interaction. You'll see more of that later on. The picture on the bottom shows something quite similar, except that here, it's not the vessel width that is changing. Here, it's actually the velocity that is changing. We have slower red blood cells with this more parachute shape, and the faster they're moving, the more they take on this bullet shape moving through the blood vessel. So it's vessel size and blood flow velocity, which determines the shape. And maybe you can already imagine that this will, of course, also affect the resistance of these red blood cells to pass through, which we will perceive as a changing viscosity. So that's where we're starting to get into the story of understanding how viscosity is changing. Yeah, what else do you know? Well, maybe one more word about the membrane. The membrane itself, although it's very flexible to bending, it's very stiff to stretching. So something which is very stiff to stretching cannot really change its area, its surface area. So the surface area of a red blood cell is almost constant. You cannot really make it bigger or smaller because you cannot really stretch the membrane, but you can bend the membrane. Now, let us do a thought experiment. What if red blood cells were spherical? If they were spherical, they probably would not be deformable. Why is that? Well, a sphere is an optimal shape in the sense that it's the smallest, that it is the smallest possible surface area for a given volume. Right? So if you wanted to have a sphere with a certain surface area and you want to change the volume, the shape of that sphere, you would invariably start to increase the surface area, to which you have a lot of resistance because the membrane is very stiff. So with that in mind, it should become clear why the red blood cell actually is not of spherical shape, but has this apparently much more complex shape, this discoid shape. Why? Because that way it has a lot more surface area in the first place, and it can actually deform, and it needs this deformability to be able to pass through small vessels. Okay, so that's sort of an explanation why red blood cells are not made spherical. You could ask yourself, why shouldn't they be spherical? Well, that's the reason. Another thing that is probably not that well known is that red blood cells can also change their shape, not just due to mechanical stimuli, but let's say due to chemical stimuli, or let's say due to stress, biological stress. If red blood cells do not feel well, if they're under stress, they will change their shape. They can take on like these shapes, they're called echinocytes or spherical echinocytes. There are also shapes they're called stomatocytes, so they can take on all kinds of shapes. There's also diseases related to that. For instance, a well-known one is the so-called sickle cell anemia. We see this here on bottom right. The picture on the left, this is such a sickle cell, red blood cell, and of course, it's clear the deformability of such a red blood cell has decreased a lot and has a lot more problem passing through small blood vessels, which will end up in a disease. Obviously. What else do we know about red blood cells? Is maybe more of an overview, summary overview. We have here an example of a red blood cell, a deformed red blood cell as a numerical simulation. It talks a bit about the network of the membrane. It has more information on the actual structure of the membrane itself. That is something which is very important for people who are actually studying how the transport of oxygen is working. How does the oxygen get out of the red blood cell, and how does it eventually get across the vessel wall and into the tissue? It's a highly interesting study, which is a very hot topic right now. For those of you who are more interested in that, there's an excellent review by Freund, Annual Review of Fluid Mechanics in 2014. I actually will upload this on our Moodle page, so you have access to that. A few more pictures on the deformability. Let's see. Turn this movie here. So what do we see here? This is an experiment, actually an experiment we did in our group a few years ago. This is a microfluidic chip made out of PDMS, silicone, and it has channels in it, tiny channels, around 10 microns, rectangular channels, 10 microns width. And you see red blood cells moving through it. And if you look close enough, these are actually echinocytes. Now you see this spiky structure. They do not have this nice round shape of a healthy red blood cell. This is actually an experiment where the red blood cells were under stress, did not feel well. That's why they created these spiky structures here. I see them nicely. One of the reasons I wanted to show this movie as well is that this chip had a little fault. It was not manufactured right, so it had a little obstruction here. We didn't plan for that, but it turned out to be an interesting case, and you can see how the red blood cells are actually squeezing through this narrowed area and take on back on the movie on the right, that's also from our group. It's a few years later, it's more recent. You see we managed to handle the red blood cells much better. They have more of this discoid shape, but nevertheless they are deforming heavily, especially those who are so-called lingering, they're hanging over the apex. They can undergo quite heavy deformation. You can also observe, especially when they come in clusters, that there's a lot of particle-particle interaction. So these red blood cells, they do a lot, and how they do it, how they interact with each other, how they deform, this all creates forces, costs energy, deformation energy, which has a direct effect on the perceived resistance, on the perceived rheology of the blood. Yeah, more pictures on deformability. I think I don't need to go into any more detail. More or less, that's what I already said. If the bullet-shaped red blood cells in very narrow vessels, and more like these parachute-shaped vessels in red blood cells in the larger vessels. Another interesting phenomenon here is shown in this picture. This is the phenomenon of tank treading and tumbling. I'll show you a little animation in the next slide to explain it a bit better. Maybe we start first with the tumbling. So this is row C and row D. And tumbling is really what the name suggests. These red blood cells are tumbling or rotating. Maybe when they flow close to a wall, it looks like they're rolling or tumbling along the wall. This is especially nicely here in this row D, where we see different pictures at different points in time of a single capsule, how it is tumbling in clockwise direction. The less obvious motion is the one we have up here. At first glance, especially in row A, but to a certain extent also in row B, the capsule or the red blood cell is not really changing its shape. It always looks the same way. It actually has this slightly tilted position with respect to the main flow direction. And only if you put a little marker on the surface of the cell, you will realize that the surface is actually rotating. So the overall shape stays the same, but the surface, the membrane, is actually rolling like the tread of a tank around the fluid contained inside the red blood cell. This is called this tank treading phenomenon. You have here a little movie which visualizes that a bit better. We have the tumbling here on top, classical tumbling in clockwise direction. And here we have tank treading in motion, where we see that the overall shape is barely changing. So if you saw only the overall shape, you would not see anything. But if you have a marker on the surface of the red blood cell, you see that surface actually moving. What the role of this tank treading really is not completely understood. You could think, for instance, that it has an effect of churning, of mixing the contents of the red blood cell, which may be important when you need to release the oxygen. So you want the oxygen to be released not just on the surface, but also on the inside. And it's more easy if you continuously mix the contents of the red blood cell. It's just an idea. It's not established yet what the physiological role of that tank treading is. Okay, so much about red blood cells. There's one definition we need to set, because it's an important one in this context, and it's the one of the hematocrit. And most of you will already know what it is, but let me define it properly. Hematocrit is the ratio of blood volume that is occupied by red blood cells. It may be important to understand it's not the ratio by, or the content by weight, is by volume. So typically hematocrit in men are slightly higher than in women, but it's somewhere around, say, 45% in most humans. Can be lower or higher, depending on the individual. So what does that mean? Around 40 to 50 or 40-45% of the volume of whole blood is taken up by erythrocytes or red blood cells. If you look at the literature, you will find many different variables. Very commonly, H or HT is used. Sometimes you also see HCT or packed cell volume. You have to be a bit careful when you look at these different variables. But we'll try to use mostly H or HT for the hematocrit. Then, what other blood particles do we have? Well, white blood cells, very important for the immune system. There are many different forms of white blood cells, rather small ones like the ones we see here in this animation here. They have only a diameter of 10 microns, but most white blood cells are far bigger. They maybe go up to 50, 60, 70 microns. As I said before, they are not all that important in terms of blood rheology, or actually not important at all. They can be important if you want to study the mechanics of the immune system. For instance, what they were studying here in this simulation is to understand why white blood cells tend to move toward the walls, where they need to do their work, right? If they need to act on some kind of an information or for an object, they need to move. They need to be transported with the blood flow, and then at the right location, they need to squeeze through the wall, through a gap in the wall, and go out into the tissue and do their work. Right? So the question here was, is there something fundamentally fluid mechanical in these flows with a lot of particles, which make the large white blood cells move preferentially to the walls? Yeah, here you have a list of white blood cells. I don't want to go into any detail here. It's just for completeness sake. I copied out this table out of the Wikipedia page. Right? But you can see there's many different types. Then the blood platelets. There are even fewer blood platelets in terms of volume. Well, probably not fewer platelets, but in volume they're less than white blood cells, and definitely much less than red blood cells. However, blood platelets are quite important from an engineering point of view, especially if we're designing implants, cardiovascular implants. One of the huge problems of cardiovascular implants is the formation of thrombi, of blood clots, and they can be very dangerous. They can cause, for instance, a stroke. So you want to prevent the formation of blood clots, and blood clots, one classical mechanism of generating blood clot is the activation of the blood platelets. Blood platelets, thrombocytes are also called. They're typically flat discs of around 2 microns that are even smaller than red blood cells. And typically, in a normal case where you have a wound and you want to start a coagulation process, it's the release of collagen and the von Willebrand factor which activates them. This is sort of the normal, let's say, physiological way of activating them. But what is more interesting in terms of, or let's say more dangerous, when you design an implant, is that platelets can also be activated by excessive mechanical stress. So you can think of let's say a fatigue process over time. If you continuously stress these platelets, after some time, there's some kind of a failure in the sense that they say, okay, I've had enough, I'm getting activated now, and they will trigger the whole cascade, which eventually leads to the formation of thrombi. Okay, so maybe the thrombocytes itself, they do not matter so much for the blood rheology, but we do not want to forget them, and we do not want to forget that these are actually rather fragile objects, and if they're stressed too much in the blood flow, eventually they may cause huge problems, namely the formation of thrombi. Yeah, we come actually talking about all these things, come to the last topic of this introductory part, and that's on blood damage. And so blood damage is sort of an overarching name for a lot of phenomena. One, the hemolysis. So the hemolysis describes the rupture of red blood cells. So red blood cells also are, to a certain degree, fragile objects. And if you stress them too much, if you tear too much on it, they will rupture and will release the hemoglobin. You can actually measure that. You can measure free hemoglobin in blood, and you can get an idea of how much hemolysis there was. And this is something especially occurring, for instance, in patients that are on ECMO systems, extra corporal oxygenation units. So like if they cannot breathe by themselves anymore, they have blood passing through a machine, and there are usually high shear stress, and their hemolysis can actually be a problem. For hemolysis, you need shear stresses, on the order of 100 Pascal to actually get a platelet lysis, or to break platelets, the blood platelets, thrombocytes, or to activate them, you need lower shear stresses on the order of 10 Pascal. So 10 Pascal for platelets, 100 Pascal for red blood cells. So just to get an order of magnitude. Of course, in reality, it's not just a simple threshold that has to be surpassed for them to rupture. It's actually the whole history of what such a platelet or such a red blood cell experiences throughout their life. So think of a red blood cell or of a platelet passing through an artificial heart valve, for instance. We see this down here, numerical simulation. Here we have this heart valve. It's a mechanical heart valve. We'll look at them later on. I think in 3 weeks. It's a bileaflet heart valve. When leaflets are closed, they look like that. When they're open, it looks like that. So you're now here in this open shape, so blood can pass through. But of course, we have these objects inside the blood flow, and we will have elevated shear stresses, at least at certain locations. We will have maybe even turbulent flow structures here with even higher shear stresses. A red blood cell may pass through this valve and maybe just for a few hundredths of a second experience elevated shear stresses, but it may not rupture. But over time, it will come back into the heart again and will pass through it again. So maybe after, I don't know how many heartbeats or how many times it has passed through, it will have had a history of so much load, and that's why I called it a fatigue process before, that over time it will fail. We'll have a failure mode. Or what is even more dangerous in these devices is that we have recirculation regions where particles that have experienced elevated shear stresses recirculate, maybe back here in this corner, and pass through the region of high shear stress again and again and again until they finally rupture. So studies of blood damage, also modeling blood damage, trying to integrate these experienced stresses, and there's also a relaxation or a healing process over time, is rather complex, and there's a lot of scientists trying to create good models for measuring, for quantifying the likelihood of blood damage. This is also a very, very hot topic of research. Okay, so I think we're through with the first part of this lecture, this 2-hour lecture. So I would like to take a short break here and then continue with the actual topic of blood viscosity. All right, so we come to the second part of today's lecture on blood rheology, and the next few slides I would actually like to talk about the viscosity of blood itself. So as already mentioned, in large blood vessels at least, we can safely consider blood to be a Newtonian fluid. And Newtonian, as I tried to explain in the previous hour, is a fluid for which the viscosity can be considered constant or nearly constant. The dynamic viscosity of blood, if we consider it to be Newtonian, if we look at it in large blood vessels, is on the order of 0.004 Pascal second, or in a certain range. That depends a bit on the particular individual or the, let's say, the local hematocrit and so on. So this is roughly 3 to 4 times, or let's say roughly 4 times higher than the viscosity of water. If we look at the kinematic viscosity of blood, I hope you remember the kinematic viscosity nu is given as the dynamic viscosity divided by the density. And this is just essentially shorthand notation. For mu divided by rho, we write nu. So the kinematic there's a typo, kinematic viscosity of blood is on the order of 4 times 10 to the minus 6 meters squared per second, compared to the well of water, where we have roughly 10 to the minus 6 meters squared per second. This, of course, is simply taking the dynamic viscosity and divided by the blood density, which is very close to the density of water. It's roughly 1,050 kilograms per cubic meter, compared to 1,000 kilograms per cubic meter for water. Okay, so keep these values in your mind. I think it's good if you're aware that the viscosity of blood is roughly 4 times the viscosity of water. Of whole blood, we have seen the separate components having different viscosities. But if we look at the whole thing as a homogeneous solution, then that's what we usually do. So whenever we calculate fluid mechanics in large blood vessels, we will use these values. If we go to small blood vessels, or also special case of stagnant stagnant blood that is not flowing, like blood that's sitting, for instance, in a reservoir. So there we do get significant non-Newtonian effects. Non-Newtonian effects in the sense that mu is not a constant, but mu is a function of the hematocrit rate, of temperature, shear rate, and also that's something we learn later on this hour, of the vessel diameter itself. That sounds surprising, but we'll see it's quite significant and important effect. There's one concept we need to learn or define. It's the concept of the apparent viscosity. And the apparent viscosity, if we describe it mathematically, is derived from Poiseuille's law, or this is how you can actually measure it. It corresponds to the viscosity you would have in a Newtonian fluid if it was flowing through a pipe of diameter d, length L, at a flow rate Q, creating a certain pressure of delta P. This maybe sounds a bit complicated, but when you draw the picture of how you can actually determine an apparent viscosity, then it should become clear. So let me see if I can draw a little sketch here. Go to a whiteboard. You can see that. The whiteboard here. So let's assume you do have a, oops, that's a bit big as a pipe. So let's see, we'll say we have a tube here. Oh, it's not very straight. I guess you get the idea. And this tube has a length L. It has a diameter D, and there's a flow going through this tube, which we call Q. And in order to do that, to get this flow Q, we need to have a pressure difference of delta P. And let me indicate this pressure difference by two water columns that we have here at either end of the tube. Or water column, or I should say blood columns. The one here is filled rather high, and the one here is not filled that high. And so we do have a pressure head here corresponding to a pressure difference delta P. So this is the classical situation of a flow, a pressure-driven flow through a pipe of diameter d, length L, creating a flow rate Q in function of the pressure difference delta P. If this was a Newtonian fluid, there would be a certain viscosity associated to that. And that viscosity you can compute with that formula. So what we do when we want to determine the apparent viscosity is that we do this experiment, or at least virtually we do this experiment, and ask ourselves, what viscosity would the fluid need to have in order to have this flow rate Q in this given pipe for the given pressure difference. So this is the concept of how to determine, maybe let me this again, how to determine here this property of the fluid mu A standing for apparent viscosity. Let's move back to the slide here. So this is the apparent viscosity. So whenever we look at plots in the following, we will show the apparent viscosity. So what does the plot appear, what viscosity does it appear to have? First plot here is an older figure from an old book by Burton, 1969, which is actually a didactically excellent treatise on blood. It shows how the viscosity or the apparent viscosity of blood depends on the hematocrit. So we have the hematocrit here on the abscissa and the apparent viscosity here on the ordinate. And we see that for typical hematocrits, if we take like a larger vessel here, this is the vessel diameter, so a vessel of nearly 1 millimeter diameter, we have this viscosity of somewhere around 4. Here the unit is centipoise, but this is actually in SI units called Pascal, or 0.004 Pascal second. And we see that as the hematocrit increases, of course, in a living human being, it will never be 80%, but at least in a glass tube, you can create that. The hematocrit increases significantly. And of course, we can ask ourselves, is there something like an optimal hematocrit? Because if we look at the role of red blood cells, we immediately see that the more red blood cells we have, the more oxygen we can transport. Okay, so there's some kind of a competition. The more oxygen, the more red blood cells, the higher the hematocrit, the more red blood cells we transport, the more oxygen we transport. At the same time, the higher the hematocrit, the higher the viscosity, the more power we need, the more force, the more the heart needs to pump to push the blood through the body. So there should be some kind of an optimum level. And let's look at this graphically again. Let me go again to a whiteboard here to show that. Let's get rid of this sketch here. And let's look at the optimal oxygen perfusion. And we have two competing aspects. One is increase the hematocrit So H up is good. And the second one is decrease the viscosity. So the lower the viscosity, the easier it is, the less resistance we have when we need to push blood through the body. So let me draw this diagram or schematically draw it again. What we had before in the slide, hematocrit here, viscosity here. We have a curve which somewhat looks like that. Okay. So at any given point, we have a certain hematocrit and associated with that, we have a certain viscosity. If we take these two criteria, so we want the highest possible hematocrit for the lowest possible viscosity, what we actually are saying here, we want to minimize the following ratio. We want to minimize mu over h. Okay. We want to find the point on this curve for which this ratio mu over h is minimal. That will be the optimal hematocrit for which you have the highest possible hematocrit at the lowest viscosity. Now let's see if we can understand this ratio mu over h a bit better. What is mu over h? Well, mu over h is actually draw a line here. This is actually the slope of this line. Or if we say the angle alpha, sine alpha is just mu over h, right? Or minimum alpha is, or sorry, the minimum mu over h corresponds to the smallest possible alpha. So the question is, maybe we set some colors here. Let's make this clear. So where do we need to move this red dot to find the smallest possible alpha? The answer should be quite clear. Let's use blue color. That the solution is here. Let's see if I can do this. That's actually the tangent going through the origin. This is the smallest possible alpha. And where the tangent touches this line, we have the optimal hematocrit with it associated. Viscosity. Okay. So if we get this concept, let's go back to the actual curve or the actual slides and see that we have this curve. And essentially what we need to do, we need to draw a tangent to these curves which goes through the origin. And the point where we touch the curve, that's the optimal hematocrit. And you probably see with your bare eyes that this will be somewhere between 40 and 50. And actually here in these pictures, we see that again. We see here the curve for men. And yeah, actually I think there's a little mistake here. This should not go through the origin itself. yeah, the optimum is somewhere around here. And for whatever reason, no test what the reason is, they also drew a line for camels, this line for camels, and the tension for the camel here touches here. And the optimal hematocrit for a camel is around 30. And guess what the camel has? A typical hematocrit of somewhere around 30. Okay, so this is an explanation for the hematocrit being somewhere between 40, 45, and so on. There are, of course, limitations in this explanation, but it should give you an idea of that this choice doesn't just come from anywhere. There's actually quite a mechanical reason for this selection. Yeah, here we have this representation again. This is sort of the value of the ratio, the inverse of the mu over h. This is h over u, the maximum hemoglobin per viscosity, which is highest here for the camel and the highest here for man, which then directly corresponds to the hematocrit we actually find. So there is an optimal hematocrit. And now the story about the shear. I showed you this animation last hour of this mixture between water and cornstarch, which was a shear thickening fluid. So the more shear rate we have, the faster the vibration or the more intense the vibrations are, the more the viscosity increases, creating these shapes over the loudspeaker. And blood is the opposite. It's a shear thinning fluid, which means that its viscosity goes down with shear. So what does that mean? If we have high shear rates, we get viscosity, if you look over here, somewhere around 4 centipoise. 4 centipoise is this old non-SI unit and SI unit, so at the 0.004 Pascal seconds. So this is the classical situation that we do have in large blood vessels. And if the shear rate is reduced, and in extreme case when it's very small and we give it some time, we end up in a configuration, I'll show you a picture later on, where the blood platelets tend to aggregate, tend to form larger structures called rouleaus. And because you have microscopically then these larger structures, the blood appears to be thicker. The apparent viscosity significantly increases. This is what you have if you have stagnating blood, if you have blood that is not moving or barely moving anymore. Just to get a bit of an order of magnitude calculation, I'll see if I can actually write here on the slide itself with my pen. Yep, I think you can do this. If we want to estimate the shear rate, the shear rate has something to do with du dy. And if we look at the large blood vessel, and for simplicity, we assume we have a velocity profile which roughly looks like this. We'll learn more about this in another lecture. But we say we have a typical velocity here of u naught, and we have a diameter of v. There you can say, well, the shear rate has something to do with u naught over d. Now, this is really, we're not talking about order of magnitude estimation. And if we look at the aorta, for instance, where we have velocities on the order of 1 meter per second, probably a bit higher than that, maybe 2 meters per second is peak velocity. And the diameter on the order of centimeters, so again, it's just an order of magnitude calculation. We end up with something in the order 10 to the 2 over second. So a shear rate of about 100 over a second. So we're in this range here, or to be a bit more general, in large blood vessels, we're somehow in this range here, where we have the viscosity that we stated before. So this is the range of large vessels where this curve is flattening and blood is locally considered to be nearly a quasi. As soon as we go into small vessels, we get all these kind of funny effects, and blood has a tendency to have an increased viscosity. Yeah, here's a picture of these rouleaux. They're called Münzrollen, money rolls. This is actually a reversible process. You can get it if you take a bucket of blood and reduce or let it flow maybe between two flat plates and move the flat plates against each other. When you slow down, sorry, up here. Then when you slow down, the shear rate goes towards zero, and you will observe slowly that the red blood cells are aggregating in these money rolls, but when you accelerate again, they tear apart again. So it's a reversible process. Physiologically, this plays less of a role than what you might think, because in the human body, you will hardly find any normal region where shear rates get low enough for money rolls to form, or if they get low enough, they only get low enough for very short periods of time. And this process takes several seconds. It takes several seconds for the money rolls to form. So usually we never find these, or hardly, very, very few places where we do find these money rolls. So most of the time, we're in a situation where the red blood cells are well separated. Okay, so much for blood viscosity changes, blood rheology, as long as we only consider the blood itself. But now what is happening if the blood is actually in the blood vessels itself? Just some pictures of blood vessels. I think I've shown you this here before. This is a micro CT image of the microcirculation of a rat brain cortex, and especially here the smallest vessels. These are capillaries. Here's a close-up of that. You see it here, these capillaries, they're on the order, this is a scale bar of around 5 microns. And you have the larger vessels, they're called arterioles. This is a bit of the structure of the microcirculation. There will be a separate lecture on that, so I don't want to go in any detail. Just give you a bit of an idea. We're talking of vessels of 10 to 100 microns. They're called arterioles. Capillaries of 4 to 8 microns, so about the size of a red blood cell itself. And then on the downstream side, we have the venules, so little veins, which are going again up to 100 microns. The border, when you start to call it artery and veins, is not very sharp. It can go even to a few hundred micrometers. Okay. Yeah, some scales of the microcirculation. We see here in typical arterioles like this, a 60 micron arteriole. We have like velocities of, here in that example, of 12 millimeters per second. It's all small Reynolds numbers, all small Womersley numbers. Yeah, maybe here capillaries, velocities here in that case even lower than 1 millimeter per second. Just to give you a bit of an idea of what the ranges we are in. Now, what is actually happening when we're in these small vessels? First of all, as a general statement, flow in small blood vessels is significantly different from flow in large vessels, and that has mainly to do with the presence of red blood cells. And I think it's obvious in that case, where the vessels are so small that the red blood cells have to heavily diform, but it's also the case in larger vessels, which are maybe a few times larger than red blood cells. That is maybe less obvious, but we'll come to that. If we just try to think of what's going on with the fluid flow, and for simplicity, we just consider a small capillary with a single file of red blood cells. So maybe the configuration we have here or in this picture, as they all come in single files. If we do have sections where there's only plasma, and plasma is a Newtonian fluid, we can safely assume that there will be something like a Poisson flow, so a parabolic velocity profile. This is a perfect laminar flow. Whenever we do have a red blood cell, so the red blood cell, to first order approximation, is moving through the vessel like a rigid object. I know it's deforming, but just for simplicity, we just think of it as it's like a bullet-shaped or cylindrical object moving through the object through the vessel. So we have zero at the wall and non-zero velocity on the surface of the red blood cell. So that gives us a Couette type flow, perfect shear flow between in the small gap between red blood cell and vessel. So we have these two fundamental types of flows, and of course there's regions where we have a mix of the two, and if we have many red blood cells close together, we mostly have the Couette flow, and if we have sections with very few red blood cells, we have mostly the Poisson flow. This whole situation has been first investigated, or maybe not first, but he was the one who made the big discovery by Robin Fåhraeus in the 50s, a Swedish physiologist. And the major result, or one of the major results that he found out, is first not on the viscosity, but on the hematocrit. What he found is that the hematocrit in small blood vessels is changing in function of the size of the vessel. And second, he found that the apparent viscosity of blood is decreasing when vessels get smaller. So let's just list this again, because it's quite counterintuitive. The smaller a vessel becomes, the lower the apparent viscosity is. The fluid itself is not really changing, it's always the same blood. But the apparent viscosity, or let's say the resistance to flow, measured by the viscosity or the apparent viscosity, appears to be smaller the smaller the vessel is. Let's start first with this hematocrit story. Not the viscosity now, first the hematocrit story. This is named the Fåhraeus effect. So what was Fåhraeus' observation? Fåhraeus observed that the hematocrit of blood flowing in a narrow vessel, here, this sketch, it's a narrow vessel, so narrow meaning typically less than 0.3 millimeters. The hematocrit of that blood, we call this the tube hematocrit, is smaller than the hematocrit we would measure in the same blood, but when it's discharged into a bucket. Okay, doesn't sound right, huh? So we take the same blood in a vessel, drain it into a bucket. We measure the hematocrit once in the tube, and we measure it the second time in the reservoir, and compare the two hematocrits, and we see the HT, the tube hematocrit, is smaller than the discharge hematocrit. And we see that this difference is actually changing with the diameter of the tube. If the tube is 1 millimeter larger, the two hematocrits are actually the same. We don't see a difference. But as soon as the vessel becomes smaller, let's say 0.3, 0.1, down to capillary size, the hematocrit can be roughly 30% lower than the discharge hematocrit. And I think it's worthwhile that we try to understand this phenomenon in quite some detail. To that end, I would like to go to the whiteboard again. Get rid of this picture here, and let us draw that image again that we had before. So we have this narrow tube. I don't make it that narrow, so I have space to draw. This is filled with blood, and the blood comprises the plasma. Let me do this maybe here in yellow. So we have some kind of velocity profile, maybe Poisson profile or something similar. And we have a bunch of red blood cells in it. I'll just draw a few of them. Okay. And that whole thing, that blood is somehow draining into a bucket. And that bucket will eventually be filled with this blood, which is mixed, a mixture of the plasma and of the red blood cells. There we go. And we call it HB, discharge hematocrit here, and here the ratio is called HT. Okay. Now let us look at the drained volume per time unit delta T. Let's see how much blood, the volume of blood is drained into the bucket. So if we consider a velocity UB bar to be the mean velocity of blood flow. Now you can consider this to be like the mean of this yellow velocity profile. And if we multiply this by the cross-sectional area A, this would be the cross-section of the tube. And if we multiply this by delta T, then we get the drained volume of blood, namely whole blood, so the plasma and the RBCs together. Let's do the same thing, but only for the RBCs. And let's, just for the sake of doing it, let's give the red blood cells a separate velocity, URBC, or the mean red blood cell velocity. Then the volume of drained red blood cells will be URBC times cross-section A, but now we need to be careful. It's not the whole cross-section A will be filled with red blood cell, but only a ratio of the cross-section will be filled with red blood cells, and namely that's the ratio HT. If the hematocrit is, tube hematocrit is 50%, only 50% of the cross-section will be red blood cells, the other 50% will be plasma. And then again, times delta T. Good. So we have two volumes drained into the bucket, and whatever we have in the bucket will then be the volume of whole blood and the volume of RBCs. So therefore, the discharge hematocrit HD, sorry, it should be an equal sign, HD, is the volume of red blood cells divided by the volume of blood. So we divide the two formulas with each other. RBC bar times A times HT times delta T divided by U blood times A times delta T. Of course, this here cancels out. So we end up with URBC over UB times HT. So let's use here, right? So we have HT is equal to this expression. Okay. So we already see HD and HT do not have to be the same. They're actually related to each other via this ratio here. And if Rheology observed that HT, write this down, Rheology's observation was that HT is smaller than HD, at least in small vessels. This immediately means, from this formula we have here, that this ratio URBC over UB must be larger than 1. Or in other words, URBC must be larger than UB. Okay. What do we do with it? We have found that the red blood cell velocity, the average velocity of red blood cells, must be faster than the average velocity of blood. How can it be? Well, if red blood cells were homogeneously distributed in the blood, the average velocities would be exactly the same. However, maybe it's easier if you think of a river, instead of a blood vessel, think of a big river. And of course, the water in the center of the river is flowing faster than the water close to the borders of the river. Think of maybe some leaves. In autumn, you have some leaves coming down from the trees. And let's think of the leaves in the center of the river. Of course, these leaves are moving much faster than the average velocity of the water. So that means, if we translate that back to the blood vessel, if the red blood cells are predominantly, I want to start in red. If the red blood cells are predominantly in the center of the vessel, where the flow is faster, the average red blood cell velocity will be higher than the average blood velocity, and we get exactly this effect here, and finally the Rheology effect. And that's exactly the story. The Rheology effect is only possible if we have a so-called axial concentration for red blood cells. Red blood cells tend to flow not close to the wall, but they tend to flow more in the center, which gives them a higher average red blood cell velocity, which is higher than the average blood velocity, which creates the Rheology effect. Let's move back to the slide. Okay, that's the Rheology effect. This is what it actually looks like. We see here the ratio between tube and discharge hematocrit, and we see that for vessel diameters, let's say above 500 microns with, somewhere 0.3, 0.5, the whole effect nearly disappears. And we have nearly a ratio of 1. But as soon as we go to small vessels, like here we have a minimum somewhere around 10, we have a reduction of the tube hematocrit of about 30%. And this can be explained by the actual concentration. In narrow blood vessels, RBC tend to concentrate in the center of the vessel. There exists a so-called cell-depleted layer, a cell-depleted layer between the core flow and the wall. There's a thin layer close to the wall, which has barely any red blood cells in it. There's an actual train model. You will do this in a homework assignment, which can help you to understand this phenomenon. Second effect is not the Rheology effect, but the Rheology-Lindquist effect. I think Lindquist was the assistant to Rheology, and they had this effect, which looks, in terms of the curve, almost the same as the Rheology effect, except that it's not the hematocrit that is reduced, it's the relative apparent viscosity that is reduced. We have here, for larger vessels, for the millimeter larger, we have this apparent viscosity of, I think that's around 3.5 here in that case. And if we go to smaller vessels down below, let's say 8 microns, we have a reduction of the viscosity nearly by a factor of 3. And that's quite dramatic. 3 times lower viscosity in the smallest vessels in the capillaries. And with the actual train model, it's now relatively easy to understand this phenomenon. Let me go back to this picture here. So most red blood cells are concentrated in the core, and we have a layer between the core flow and the wall where there's only plasma. What do we know about the viscosity of plasma? We know it has a lower viscosity. So we can think of this layer as a lubricating layer, which is lubricating the flow of red blood cells. Hence, the more we have of this actual concentration, the lower the apparent viscosity is. And that's exactly the effect that we see here. Now we have more actual concentration in smaller vessels. What is happening in very small capillaries? Well, here the curve goes up again dramatically, quite dramatically actually. What is happening? Well, it's a reversal of the Rheology-Lindquist effect, because this is, we see here, we have 8 microns, this is exactly where the red blood cells have to deform so heavily because they're bigger than the vessel itself, and the whole deformation energy, the energy we need to deform the red blood cells, that is expressed as a resistance. That is expressed as a higher apparent viscosity. Okay, so this is kind of the explanation of the Rheology-Lindquist effect. Both Rheology and Rheology-Lindquist effect are based on the phenomenon of actual concentration, and both can explain this type of curve, once for the apparent viscosity and once for the hematocrit. This was well understood, well accepted, experimentally demonstrated up until I think some 80s or 90s. And then people sort of realize, well, it's not the whole story. As long as you did these experiments in glass tubes, that's how the curves came out. We had a minimum in these curves of around 8 microns. When they did this in vivo, the curve still had roughly the same shape, this shape here, but they did not have the minima at these low diameters. So the in vivo Faraday effect was quantitatively different, shifted to higher values, to higher diameters. The question, of course, what's different? Why is an actual blood vessel so different from an in vitro from a glass tube? And this is the last topic I want to touch today, and this is the endothelial surface layer, which was discovered mainly when we had also the right imaging tools. These are cross sections of small blood vessels, actually capillaries. You see here a scale bar, and these black things here, it looks a bit like grass growing on the surface. This is called the glycocalyx, or some people talk more generally about the whole endothelial surface layer, and the glycocalyx is part of that. So what are these? These are large molecules. Here we see it again. It looks a bit like grass. These are large molecules, I think sugar-like molecules, that are lining the inner side of the smallest blood vessels, mainly of capillaries, such that there's always this little gap here between the wall, this is this line, the endothelial wall of the capillary, and the red blood cell. And what looks like there's nothing in between is in reality is this glycocalyx, which is fluid mechanically not just an open space, but it's more like, maybe you can think of like a wheat field through which the plasma has to squeeze, of course, increasing the resistance to flow, and of course, reducing the effective cross-sectional area of the blood vessel. So even though the size of the blood vessel looks to be bigger, in reality, with this endothelial surface layer, the really open surface is a bit smaller. And that's the majority of the explanation for these differences between in vivo and in vitro Faraday-Lindquist effect. But there's even more to this. And to this end, it's important to understand that the glycocalyx, or the endothelial surface layer, is not just a solid layer reducing the lumen of the vessel, but it's actually a flexible layer. It has mechanics of its own. So this wheat field, if you like, they can deform. So if a red blood cell is passing through, they will deform these molecules. And if the red blood cells are moving through relatively slowly, they will deform them heavily, and the red blood cells will sink into this layer. As we have here in the grayscale, the thickness of the layer, and you see the red blood cell has sunken in, is almost touching the outer wall. On the opposite, if the red blood cell is really moving fast, it's like sliding on top of the endothelial surface layer, barely deforming it. It's maybe a little bit like when you're skiing and you're skiing on fresh snow and you're going fast, just going on top of the fresh snow. And when you stop, you start sinking in, and it takes a lot of force, or you experience a lot of resistance to get going again. So the endothelial surface layer, the dynamics of it, has again an effect on the resistance, which is directly coupled to the velocity. So what does this mean for the apparent viscosity? the apparent viscosity is not only a function of the vessel diameter, it's also a function of the velocity itself. Faster moving red blood cells or higher velocities, blood flow velocities, will lead to slightly lower apparent viscosity because the red blood cells are sliding on top of the cell. If we have very slow going blood, the red blood cells continuously sink in and have to deform the endothelial surface layer, leading to an even increased apparent viscosity. So you see, the more closer we look at this whole phenomenon, the more complex it becomes, and the more variables, the more parameters we find for the viscosity. But I think that's enough for today. I hope I could give you a bit of an idea of what blood rheology is, on what parameters blood is depending on. We're going to use these results. In beginning, we're going to look at blood flow in larger vessels. We're going to consider blood just to be a quasi-Newtonian fluid with 0.003004 Pascal second. And then in lectures on the microcirculation, we're again going to use Fareus effect, Fareus-Lindquist effect, and so on to understand the different dynamics in this fluid. So with that, I would like to close and thank you for your attention. Goodbye.